So let's jump into it. Now, boys, what I've got is the manifestos for the Conservatives and Labour government in front of me. So we're going to look at their main pledges around the economy. We're just going to talk about that and see what that means for us. So let's start with the Conservatives. So on the economic side, they're promising an extra $4 billion for schools by 2022. They're also promising to balance the budget by 2025. So for those watching, balancing the budget just basically means that they want to match what they're spending with what they receive in taxes. And right now they're currently running a deficit, which means when basically you have a deficit, you have to borrow money to plug that gap. And the UK has a public debt of about 1.7 trillion. So by balancing the budget, that means they're going to have to either cut back on their spending or raise taxes. But we'll come back to that.
But a quick one, that debt has occurred from running multiple deficits. That's how the debt gets built.
So there's a difference between the national debt and the yearly deficit, so to speak. So the national debt is what's accumulated. I think it's from, if memory serves correct, maybe like the early 2000s or just before then.
Yeah.
Because there was a budget surplus. But the debt has accumulated, national debt has accumulated since like 45. It's been around for a very, very long time.
Okay, so for the person at home, this basically is equivalent to if they have a salary and that salary is not enough to get by each month, they're borrowing on credit cards and loans. So the difference between the salary and what they're borrowing is the deficit. And the debt is if they keep borrowing. That it builds up plus the interest. So the debt is the interest plus what they're borrowing every time.
Put it this way, it's like, let's say you've got a mortgage. You've got a lot of debt over your head until it's paid off. But even though you have a mortgage, you will still have your monthly income. And if you spend more in a month, then you have to use a credit card to fund your monthly spending. That's the kind of deficit we're talking about. You will still have the mortgage that you have to pay for, which is included as part of the debt, but that's something treated separately. So,
that's cool. So extra $4 billion for schools, balanced budget by 2025. They also said they're not going to increase VAT, and they're also going to review they're going to cut corporation tax and stick with current plans to raise personal tax allowances. So breaking those down, what does that mean for somebody like me or for someone like one of us in the room?
You could take the raising of the personal tax allowance, so they want to raise it, I think it's 12 grand by 2020? 12,500 pounds by 2020. So what they're essentially saying is the first 12,500 of your earnings you don't pay tax on. So that's your personal allowance. So for example, if you're earning 30,000, take 12,500 away from that, then you pay tax on the remainder.
So that means I'm basically going to end up with more income.
And essentially,
so
what they're looking to do is essentially reduce the amount of people. So they're actually taking quite a lot of people on lower income out of them for paying the basic rate of tax. Or
I see.
20%.
So it really helps the working class to have a bit.
Well, that's what they're aiming for, yeah. So essentially, that's the target audience for raising the personal budget allowance.
And what about this not increasing the VAT? How does that impact?
Well, yeah, VAT. So by that, so that's what you're spending every day. So if you go in just to the shops to buy, say, a Mars bar or anything like that, you pay VAT, value added tax. That's the extra that you pay. So currently it's now 20%, and then they want to keep it at 20%. But a few years ago, it was 17.5%, and it's gone up to 20, and they want to now maintain it at 20%. So for the everyday consumer, again, when you're buying everyday items, that should, in essence, save you a bit of money because they don't want to raise that any further.
Well, it shouldn't make you any worse off.
You won't feel any difference. You just feel. You won't feel any more worse, I guess. But you won't feel any more better either if you're purchasing the same goods as you do on a weekly or monthly basis. It just won't change.
Okay.
And so in all of this, are the national insurance contributions staying the same?
Good question. Let me have a look.
Because if you
raise
my personal
that's true. That's a very good question.
and then increase,
so anyway, you're not
I'm not gaining anything.
So what they tried to do before this new election was, if you guys remember, they tried to increase national insurance for self-employed people, and that caused a massive backlash. Now they haven't specifically said anything in their manifesto about not touching national insurance contribution. So who knows?
Well, they did say, actually, no, they did say they made a special. They're proposing a national insurance contribution holiday to employers that are going to take on people with disabilities, people with mental health issues, people who have been in prisons, and they're saying that there's going to be a national insurance contribution holiday for them for a year. So the incentive is that employers are the ones who have to they have to put into the national insurance contribution pot, and they're saying if you take on these individuals who people tend to marginalise, i.e. people with mental health disabilities, and also those who have those who've had convictions but have paid their service, paid their debts, if you will, employers get a holiday for a year, so they don't have to pay insurance for a year. And that was something that they're proposing. So
okay, but that's just for one specific.
Yeah, that's a very specific. That's for employers, and it's also for people who have been out of work for a year as well. So in this sense, it was just an incentive for businesses only to
take on an actual person,
take on a kind of wider set of
people,
a person that they wouldn't usually take on. Yeah.
But still, with the rest of us, it
we're
could
not
potentially
sure.
go up.
Yeah,
we're not sure yet.
We're not sure. So.
Let's just back it up. What does national insurance contribution actually mean? What is that in essence?
So that's what contributes to your healthcare, so the NHS, and your pension in the long run. So
your state pension.
The state, yes, correct. Yeah, not actually. So what the government will provide you once you reach state pension age.
Okay.
And it also covers the things like paternity leave, maternity leave, sickness that's covered. Kind of like you have your statutory sick days. The NIC covers for that.
Okay. So basically, it's basically social welfare.
In a sense,
yeah.
From employers, because employers have to take a hit when you're not working, and the idea is that national insurance contribution kind of it's like it pays back into that.
Cool. So far we've seen that with the manifesto the Conservatives are proposing, there's some things that are going to hopefully give us a bit more income, but on the flip side, there's potential avenues where we could end up having less disposable income at the end of the day. There's one thing that they have said, which is another issue of contention, is they're trying to replace the triple lock pension pledge with a double lock. Now, just to break that down for people at home, what the triple lock pension was they were guaranteeing that the state pension, the one that is determined by your national insurance contribution, that they were going to increase that every year by either the higher of inflation or average earnings or 2.5%. Now, the reason that they're trying to get rid of this is that it's actually quite expensive. If you're promising people 2.5% extra each year, they have to fund that. Under this new proposal, they're going to remove that last bit, that promise of 2.5%, and just fix it to either inflation or average earnings, which means potentially they can save themselves money. I think I've seen around figures of up to 6 billion a year being saved, touted. So how again does that affect people?
I think it's a bit of the one of it's a generation divide, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because you've got like our age group and the younger generation that are saying why should we pay for all this? Because in essence, as you said, by maintaining the triple lock, as I said, that funding's got to come from somewhere, and that funding will be
tax.
Will be our generation that's funding that. So on one hand, you got our generation saying it's not fair. As Henry was saying though, the older generation said, well, we've already paid our dues, we worked hard, we paid our national insurance contributions. So it's a double-edged sword for the government in essence, because then it's kind of a generational divide.
Right, so how much is the actual UK deficit?
That's a good question.
The deficit is, i.e. the difference between what the government spend and what they earn, is 2.6% of GDP, which roughly works up to about 52 billion.
Right.
That's the difference. So that's what they have to
try and balance
the books, i.e. try and make to get to zero by 2022.
But so that's every year. So we're saying what?
2025.
It could be May 22 or May 25. It depends on when the election is, but the idea is that by the next election is to get rid of that 50 million gap between spending and earnings. So it's 50 million right now, and it's trying to get that 50 million gap right down to 50 billion, down to zero.
Is that 50 billion per year?
Yeah, it's 50. No, it's 50 billion.
In total.
50 billion is the gap in total, and it's trying to reduce that gap
But you think about it, it's quite a difficult thing to do because the government make money, but they spend money as well, so that figure can always chop and change. And so it's trying to reduce this gap from 50 billion down to zero.
There are a lot of fixed things and what I say assumptions in that. For example, that the population continues to, I say, age at the same rate. Our disease profile stays the same. Because I mean, healthcare is one of our biggest expenditures right now, and we're saying that the spending profile stays the same, and in that way, we're basically looking at just 50 billion.
Yeah.
So, but if that changes, then it can start to widen
again
or narrow.
Yeah, that's correct.
So it's actually come down from about 69 billion
Yeah.
to 50 billion now. But if they are trying to balance the budget, then, like I just said with that scenario, that means somewhere along the line,
There's gonna be cuts.
yeah, or there's going to be more taxes, eventually. So ultimately, it does have an impact on my finances, doesn't it?
I have a question.
Yeah.
What is I think we've kind of mentioned it before, but what's the UK public debt, and then what's the private debt, actually, and what's the difference?
So the UK debt is the government debt. It's what the government owes. So that's through their bonds, everything that they have issued. Where the private debt is actually us, individuals. So that's our debt, so mortgages, credit cards, loans, car loans. So that's the private sector debt. The figures I'm not 100%.
National debt is about 1.7 trillion,
Okay.
So that's the government's debt.
and then personal debt is about 1.5 trillion at the moment. This whole issue around balancing the budget opens up quite a few sort of black holes, so to speak, in terms of how it can impact us. Because if they try and balance this book,
There
that
will
can
be an impact
Yeah.
somewhere that has
somewhere
to
it will affect me, whether it's through this public services or my actual disposable income if they tax me more. And obviously the pension one is another major one. So it just depends on where you are on the age spectrum.
Yeah.
So we're going to leave it there and move on to Labour. And I really want to, I think Labour have said a few interesting things in their manifesto that I'd like to touch on. The first one is that they want to end austerity and bring about spending in public services. They also want to nationalise a lot of former public services like rail, post, water, the national grid. They also said they want to invest in the British economy to the tune of about 250 billion over the next 10 years. So they're making quite a lot of sort of ambitious plans and promises. Let's break it down. How would this impact me financially? So let's start with the end of austerity and the investment in public services.
Well, that's kind. No, go ahead. Henry.
Well, they're basically going to blow the budget from the start. Like, we've just been talking about how we need to save 50 billion. These guys are just going to go and invest another 250 billion. So it's a massive gamble. Like what they're trying to do.
What do you mean by a massive gamble?
Well, it's a gamble in the sense that if you're going to go and pump more money in, it may work, it may not work, in the sense that we don't know what the future entails for this country. Something else, we don't know what's around the corner. We don't know if there's a massive recession globally, another one coming through. And if we've just pumped another 250 billion in, that could be curtains for the country.
But on the flip side there, it could also be a good thing.
Yeah, it's a gamble.
And also, but what's not, it's paying for it now. As you said, with the Conservatives trying to reduce the deficit, if they're going, you have to get this money from somewhere. So that means either borrowing more or increasing taxes to be able to pay for what they're pledging.
Right, okay.
So, but instead of if they're saying they're going to end austerity, then that's not actually
It's less likely to increase tax. They're just going to borrow.
Most likely borrowing.
Okay, but if I'm not concerned about that, and I'm just looking at this from the basic level.
From a personal point of view,
Yeah.
you might think it's a positive thing, saying you might not care about 50, 60 years down the line. So if Labour are going to go ahead and do this now, because you're going to get that benefit now.
The funny thing is, I actually think it will benefit the country in 50, 60 years' time, more likely because of that's when you'll see the fruits
benefits of
of
it.
if they spend that 250 billion well, if they spend it wisely, if they invest it in manufacturing sector and the technology sector, if they invest it in improving the education system and healthcare and helping people to live longer, and there'll be people are going to be able to have better jobs with more people employed, paying it back, and we'll be exporting far more into the world. So in 50, 60 years' time, we'll be able to pay back that easily. But the question is, will we get killed on the borrowing?
Well, I think that so I think it was 250, which is 50 per year.
Per year.
Trying to increase. And I think Labour, what they tried to do is they tried to say that this is fully costed. Basically, what that means is whatever the additional 50 billion of spending that they're planning to implement, they're going to raise an additional 50 billion in tax.
Moving on quickly, I wanted to mention another point. So, aside from ending austerity and spending 250 billion, they've also made pledges to specific groups within the country. So, number one is students. They're going to abolish tuition fees, and they've actually brought forth that promise to this new academic year starting in September. They've also said there's not going to be any increase in personal national insurance or VAT. So, I mean, these immediately have financial benefits, for students who are not going to have debt to pay back, or even me as an individual who I'm not going to have to pay extra national insurance contribution or additional VAT on when I go into the supermarkets. So how then, with those promises and ending austerity and pumping money, does everything then fit it into the bigger picture?
It's going to be the rich that get the hit. The rich are going to take the hit on both sides. So on the corporation tax is going to be raised to 26%, I think, over the course of next few years. And there's
By
going
2020 and 2021,
yeah, and there's going to be an additional tax for anyone that's earning over
£80,000. Yeah, they're boosting it to 50%.
So that would, as Tom said, that's a fully costed position, and if everybody actually does stay in the country and pays their taxes, then it will work out.
So is it necessarily a bad thing then, if the rich are being taxed? Well, I guess
Depends
it
if
depends.
it's rich.
Starting with the Labour Party, they've said they're going to introduce rent controls and also build at least 100,000 council and housing association homes a year. I think the Tories have said they're promising to build about 1 million homes by...
a million homes between 2015 and 2020, sorry.
2020. How is this going to impact?
There's twofold. So in terms of Labour, you could say they're looking at the middle earners and the lower earners. In the sense of with the council houses they're looking to build, that'll help people on lower incomes to be able to get their council houses. And then you've got the middle earners in terms of they want to cap rent control, because the rents are hitting the middle income. They're the ones
Because it's about 1,300 in London.
Yeah, so especially that's a good thing as well. We have to disperse. There's a big difference between London and the South East and the rest of the UK in terms of house prices and wage growth. It's quite different between each region. So I know definitely in London, the middle income is quite heavily squeezed with rent. Rent is a high cost of their outgoing
Every month.
Right. So I guess that's where they're looking. So I guess it also doesn't really cure the problem in terms of for the middle income earners to still get on the property ladder. Or actually, it does to a certain extent. 'Cause I guess if rent's capped, hopefully that should allow them to save
more
to then be able to
use things like the Help to Buy.
But I think housing in general is the fact that because land is scarce, it's building of house. That's what's, especially in London and the South East anyway, that's having a big cost on house prices going up.
Right. And what about the Conservative policy then? How is that going to influence?
Well, that's general, so they're not targeting
groups.
They're just saying that they're looking to build 1 million homes between 2015 and 2020. However, I haven't seen any figures of houses that they built before that or since 2015 though. So that's what they say they're planning to do, but I haven't
How
seen
achievable that really is.
I'm not sure.
It's something else. Right. Okay. So I mean, if I'm looking to buy now, or if I'm just on the face of this, who is really going to appeal to me the most out of these two?
I think.
Depends where you sit.
It just again, it depends where you really sit. I prefer the unconstrained conservative version, saying we're just going to build 1 million houses. But I equally do appreciate what Labour are trying to do, in the sense that, you know, years ago you had Margaret Thatcher with the right to buy a council house, and it's almost being able to provide an opportunity for the lower earners being able to save more and eventually buy their house. But it doesn't address the issue of the fact that house prices are comparatively much more expensive now than they were, say, you know, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So I'm always on the fence when it comes to housing policy, because, you know, it's a very contentious issue, and it just seems the question never seems to have been answered from previous governments. And as you mentioned earlier, that, you know, we don't really have any data on the houses that have been produced. So how are we to even believe that they're even going to want to produce any more houses anyway? So I'm kind of skeptical with these policies on both sides, to be fair. So.
Okay. Well, I mean, housing aside, looking at everything that we've discussed, from the economy to housing, comparing Conservative Manifesto to the Labour Manifesto, which one is most likely to, benefit me from a financial standpoint?
It depends where you are. So if you're, and it also depends, the other thing I'd add is it depends on what your aspirations are. So the fact that we're in the UK, one thing that Margaret Thatcher was successful at doing is bringing in this mindset of owning your own home in this country, which isn't really the norm in the rest of Europe.
That's true.
Yeah.
So in Europe, people in Germany and France and Scandinavia, they're quite happy to rent all their lives, and that's quite normal. You know, as long as rent is controlled and at a level that is stable, everybody's quite happy to live like that. But in this country, that's really not. We're quite aspirational in terms of owning your own home, and that is just embedded in the fabric of our society. So, in that sense, it doesn't matter where you currently sit in society, whether it's at the bottom, middle, or top. Everybody wants to own a home in this country. So from that point of view, looking at Labour's policies, Labour don't really seem to understand that mindset which is within British culture and trying to address that.
Putting these things together, if I'm just looking at it on both hands, which one am I most likely to think actually financially, from a financial standpoint, ignoring everything else, which one is going to benefit me the most?
It's all to do with your personal circumstances, and then everyone else's personal circumstances are unique to themselves. So what you as a voter in the election will need to decide and think about how these policies will affect you personally. So as I said, it's about looking into stuff, about choosing one or the other, or say choosing a personality, say Theresa May. It's just about looking at the individual policies and seeing that's how I see it, and seeing about how it affects you personally. Because as I said, there's different brackets for the lower earners, the middle income, the higher earners. So it all depends on where you feel you sit.
How about you? How about you guys?
Yeah, I think, as you say, you just have to kind of split yourself, not split yourself, where you're in life. Am I aspiring to own a home? If I am aspiring to own a home, do I have my deposit now, or am I trying to save for the deposit? If I have my deposit now, then I might lean towards one party as opposed to the other one. But if I need some time to save my deposit, then I actually think how much. But so those are the kind of things that I think need to be thought about before you make a decision.
And I also think, to go on a bit further from that, I think it's to you as a person that's voting. I think what matters to you, it might not just be your personal circumstances, about what would you like the country to look like. So in terms of infrastructure, 20, 30 years down the line, or the NHS that we have, what kind of NHS would you like to see when you get a bit older? What kind of, how would you like schools to be set up? Because the two parties have different views on how schools should be. as well as your personal income and, you know, in terms of houses and things like this. I think it's kind of what issues are reported to you, and on that basis, you then make a decision.
That makes sense, easy. NHS is important to me, so
I'll go with that. Cool. No, thanks guys for joining us today. And for those listening, I hope you've gained something from this, and hopefully it shed a bit more light on different issues within currently the UK political sphere. Join us next time for more on Economic Street Bits. I'm Ola.
And I'm Nicholas.
See you next time.
Thank you guys for joining us on our first edition of Economic Street Bits. Please join us next time where we'll be discussing Brexit and the upcoming Brexit negotiations.
Yeah, you can catch us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Like, share, comment, and let us also know what topics you would like us to discuss. And yeah, stay tuned.